Hi. In these times of social isolation, I think it's even more important to make human connections. And recently, I had the good fortune of meeting Don Thompson, who is a documentarian and with whom I've had these very interesting conversations. And we thought that other people might be interested in these topics and as fascinated as we are with these different subjects that we explore together. So we decided to record these conversations and share them. And this is the first one. So, yes, my hair is wet and I won't do it again. But anyway, I hope you enjoy it. So, Don, we spoke about the importance of talking about the feminine and the masculine as it pertains our society nowadays. Why do you think this is important?
Well, I think that it's important for a few different reasons, but primarily I think that in my mind, the issue of men and women, of the human rights issue, say between men and women, is probably the most important. And I'm not just saying that because we're talking, but I do believe that it has to do, there's a lot of ramifications that fall out of the imbalance between men and women. So I thought of a term, an American Indian term called Koyaanisqatsi, which is life out of balance. And I think that, interestingly enough, also reflects in our current situation with the pandemic, which in some ways is probably a, nature's way of signifying imbalance. So I do believe that the imbalance between men and women is the core issue of the world, or a core issue of the world. And again, it has ramifications spiritually, it has ramifications economically, it has ramifications politically, or whatever. So I believe it's key.
And I would take it a step back and I would say that beyond talking about men and women, just talking about the feminine and the masculine as principles, say, for example, as yin and yang, as a way of approaching challenges. For example, both can be principles of action, but while a masculine principle of action, and this is not regarding men per se, it's just what we understand as, and we name it as a masculine approach, would be to conquer, dominate, beat, while the feminine, the yin in a way of speaking, would be to understand, to the approach would be more passive in a way, kind of like, what you would think of Jesus or Gandhi. So it's not about dominance, it's about reaching an agreement.
Yeah.
And when you face crisis like the one we're facing right now with this virus, with COVID-19, it's interesting to see the different responses and how you can see kind of those masculine and feminine principles unfold. So beyond and I completely agree with you, I think that there needs to be a balance between these two sexes that make up humanity. But beyond that, I think there's also an unbalance between the masculine principles and the feminine principles, understood beyond just the human race or gender or sex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the general tendency of men in this out of balance situation is to fear women on a certain level. And I think that fear springs from a sense of a need to control or dominate nature.
Mm-hmm.
So the feminine side, even the feminine in nature, has to do with,
and the feminine in men, right? I mean, we all have feminine and masculine. We are all creatures of different sorts of action.
right.
maybe masculine is more about reaction than action, but.
Well, I mean, I think that again, the tendency of men to, at least in the current environment, to want to control or dominate, as it reflects it also in technology, is, I mean, when you look back at indigenous cultures that lasted for thousands of years, in some ways you could say that they were backward, but they also did not, they weren't able to spin up a self-destructive paradigm within, I don't know, a few decades, which is, you know, for all the advancement of modern people, that's a pretty sad statement.
Yeah.
So I think that there's you know, I mean, I think that technology misused when conjoined with a capitalistic profit-making agenda, I think has created an overpopulation and all of the things that have come out of that has created a big problem. So, but I do believe that the indigenous cultures, and I think you probably agree with this, have had more of a sense of balance, even though they were certainly patriarchal in their outlook as well in many ways. But still, I think there was more of a respect for nature. There was more of a, whether or not it was conscious or not, whether or not it was just because they didn't have the ability, then the technology to dominate nature in the way that modern people do. Regardless, I think that there was more of a balance and more of a harmony between nature and people. And I think that in modern people, to try and strike a balance, you know, to see that imbalance within men and women is a starting place. Yeah.
It's a little bit difficult, I think, to think of, I mean, I guess that every culture has different percentages or different, like, it's not black and white. You know, you can have a little bit of the feminine, and yes, you call the earth mother nature, or, you know, mother or whatnot, but then you only have male chiefs, for example, in your tribe, which then where is the female in that? Where's the woman in that? And then you have that void. So I guess it's not always black and white, but one thing that that comes to mind in a way is this. I think that, to me, the starkest difference is between this mindset of scarcity, in which you have to take as many resources you find for yourself, and you have to almost, you know, that's where greed comes from, right? You have to, you have this sense that you have to, like squirrels, you just have to take, because you feel that there won't be enough, because you feel that you do not create. In a way, that is kind of the masculine. You know, this idea that the masculine doesn't create. The masculine actually takes action over what is. And the feminine idea of creation, in which if there's not enough, you will create more. And in a sense, that is why, even though the feminine sounds very voodoo and spiritual, I also think it's very scientific, because a lot of scientists, there are those who want to dominate and create things for domination, but many others create things actually to create. Even nuclear power wasn't really created to destroy, but as a source of energy, to create energy. So it's interesting that you can see those, the essence may be there and the manifestations are just different. I don't know if you have any thoughts over that.
Well, I mean, I've done a little studying. Let's take the Greeks, for example. The Greeks, they were a democracy, at least for a while, under Athens. And there's a lot of interesting parallels between Greece under Athens and
not exactly how we understand democracy, though, right?
That's what I was getting to, right? So the point there, of course, is that it was a male-dominated, citizen-centric view of democracy that had slaves and had the women basically would run the house, more or less. That's the way it was. So now in the Greek theater, interestingly enough, there was a very, very strong women within Greek theater. Whether you take Aristophanes or Sophocles or Euripides with Medea, for example, Medea was a very strong feminine force that some scholars like Elizabeth Vanderveer have taken a look at this and they've said, well, really, it beckons, there is a proto-matriarchal society within Greece from which the society that we saw within the democratic Greece that we all think of evolved. And this was a reaction to or a fear of that matriarchy. So, but anyway, the Medea was a very strong, powerful woman who would, take revenge on the patriarchy. And this was shown within the cycle of plays that they would do annually in Greece as sort of a public display of social and political norms. So what they...
Wouldn't you say that something cyclical that has no effect in everyday life is actually more of a strategy to keep people in check? You know what I'm saying? Like you have your catharsis and now, it's once a year, you get reprimanded and then let's just continue with life as it is. Like you do, women still could not vote and so forth.
Yeah, I'm not debating that. The point I was trying to make was regarding the evolution of the rule of law. So whether or not this is true, I'm talking about the perception of truth as purveyed by the theatrical dramatists of the time. Mm-hmm. We're using the feminine as a vehicle to portray the need for the rule of law, because the feminine, now I'm not saying that this is correct or incorrect or defending it in any way.
No, it's just interesting to try and understand what was the purpose behind it, what was the intent behind it. That's what I'm saying. I get what you're saying. What I'm saying is that, if you look at it, again, I may be, we can't ask, right? What was the intent?
Well, I think this becomes important even in today's context, because the idea in the Greek dramatists were trying to portray the evolution from revenge justice to the rule of law. Revenge justice to the rule of law. And
revenge justice was female.
No, I'm not saying it was female. I'm saying that the Medea was portrayed as revenge.
No, I know, but by, what I'm saying, like the idea, if you portray an idea with gender,
right,
you are creating a correlation between them.
Well, this is exactly I'm not saying it was a good thing necessarily, even though certainly the dramatists have survived, and there's the archetypes there that people seem to react to. But the point being is today, let's take a look at today's world politics. We're trying to evolve from a revenge justice, I think, in terms of the global situation, let's say the war on terror, which is a lot of it has to do with revenge justice, a tit for tat kind of justice. This is the rationale of war, to a more rule of law based situation. Ironically, in my mind, the rule of law is the rule of compassion, the rule of nurturing, the rule of let's bring everybody in under the same tent, is actually the feminine. So to me, it would be a positive thing to move into, if we moved into a global situation where we have to have these debates, in other words, in a global way. And I think that the women to me are the voice and the vehicle for that occurring in the near term as our politics evolve globally. I think that women need to, will and are and need to step up politically and have their voice heard, because I think that's the kind of voice that will allow for the collaboration that we need to have in the future if we're going to, move beyond the issues that we've seen globally with the endless wars and the perpetual war on terror and so on. Now, the COVID-19 situation may be a catalyst to help move us towards that. I hope so. I don't support pandemics, but I do think it's interesting that perhaps there's an opportunity.
It will be interesting to see, just as a side note, if this virus is actually going to isolate us on a social level, even though economically it's impossible, or not. I mean, how, given the impact on the different economies around the world, will there be more protectionism? Right. Will there be a demand, for example, of Americans saying that they want those offshore jobs brought back because now there is a patriotic need or whatnot? It will be interesting to see which way we sway, and if we understand that there are no borders when you talk of global disease. We just saw this. What has it been since December? So it's less than, it's a few months, less than 6 months. It's a few months, and we're already seeing how this spreads regardless of what language you speak or what country you live in. So yes, that will be interesting, and to see if it's going to lead to actually a more isolated or point of view, or a more global kind of approach to humanity, or maybe a mix of both. Hopefully, yeah, it's a more global view.
Exactly. So So I wanted to point out the Greeks, because I think a lot of Western culture, certainly, and we talked about this a little bit before, certainly within the West, the evolution of Greek society and cultures that evolved into Roman society, and then into, continuing on through the Western Enlightenment and into the foundation of Western democracies in the United States and in France with the French Revolution and the American Revolution. As that evolved, the Greeks have been very sort of a key template with, that we've modeled ourselves after, for good or for ill. Mm-hmm. I think that sort of the downside of that evolution has been attitudes towards women that are counter to attitudes that, I can't say that we can do a binary argument here. We can't say, well, these people have this and the West has this. But I would say in the East, let's say in India or Asia in general, there's a different attitude, a different view of women and the feminine as it involves the archetypes and how they're portrayed. So
the only thing I would say to that, interestingly, there have been, I'm not so sure in Asia actually, but perhaps in India, yes, there's been female leaders, and yet they have these awful situations in which women are the target of extreme violence.
Right.
So you have that dichotomy in which it really, exactly what are we talking about? And even so, going back a little bit to your point, I would say two things. Yes, I think it's obvious that if you have 50% of the population, and in some countries more than that, being female, talking about democracy and being represented in the government, obviously you're not seeing those same percentages in those people who participate in politics and actually get a space to share their ideas within a country's policy making. So that is on the one side. On the other, I would say, beyond women, going back to the principle of the feminine, I think it also is needed that men feel more connected and more, I would say, freer to actually get in touch with their feminine side, with the feminine principles of life. So beyond having the need to have women participate in different, sectors of society, what happens with the men who are participating? And how can you allow men in general to actually embrace the feminine without having to be all the time in overdrive in the masculine?
Yeah, I think that getting back to, at least in terms of the, but let's look, if we take a look at India, for example, in terms of some of the archetypes of the divine feminine, or the goddesses of India. So, and even it shows up somewhat in the West, particularly the cultures and spirituality and religions that came out of the Middle East. So you have this idea of the equipodes between male and female. In other words, the balance between the masculine and the feminine, as represented in, the archetypes of, well, you have what they call sacred geometry, for one thing, and Star of David would be an example of that sacred geometry. And also the yantras in India reflect the same kinds of sacred geometry. It's a balance between what you might say is the masculine A and the feminine V. These two are put, so the Star of David representing that equipoise between the two. So ideally, I'm not saying in execution, but I'm saying ideally, I think at least in the East, there's a recognition of the need for the balance between the masculine and the feminine. And I think a lot of the spiritual masters that you mentioned, Gandhi, for example, would reflect this. I think that the reason why Gandhi came out of India is no accident. I think that it's because that culture, had those archetypes had that idea of that need for that balance, and he reflected that. I think he was a very, if you will, feminine male. So, but there are numerous examples in India, some of which would be famous and some relatively unknown or obscure, of those people that would reflect that kind of balance. So I think that that to me is important, and I think that and we've talked about the shamanistic traditions or the indigenous traditions, where I think there is that kind of balance demonstrated as well. So if democracies in the ideal of democracy being representative across the board of all people, bring in the feminine, the female leaders, the feminine ideals, then perhaps democracy can evolve in a more balanced way. So
at some point, when you reference this, I think that yes, there is a lot of feminine in rituals
yes,
and in cosmovision and religion. And somehow, and again, what is the purpose of that? And how is it framed in such a way that it doesn't reflect itself in everyday life? So you have femicide, you have physical violence, you have financial violence, different kinds of violence against women, without even talking about the feminine. And in general, still you have even these Native American tribes. I mean, they were constantly, many of them, at war, against each other for territory. So it's interesting because yes, we go to this cosmovision and religion and all these rituals in which you have first of all the Virgin Mary and so many things, but how are you really framing that deity or that divinity and seeing it reflected in your fellow human who's is a woman? There's a disconnect between that femininity seen in divinity and the actual embodiment of that which you are kind of you're honoring in your fellow human.
But I think you're keying into something very interesting because wouldn't you say, I'm just asking the question, let's open this up. Would you say that economics, the resources, you mentioned before the perception of the scarcity of resources. Let's say traditionally the role of the male has been to go out and secure the bounty to bring it back to the family for the sustenance of the family. The female traditionally would be at home nurturing the child. The male needs to go out and secure the resources and bring that back home. So, so there are these perhaps even embedded within the psyche and maybe even somewhat genetically of men to go out and dominate, to secure those resources in order to be able to protect or maintain the home, the family.
Well, there are these theories that say that women were the ones who invented agriculture.
Right.
Women were the ones who invented textile.
Right.
Because again, they were, in this process, while societies were being formed, the ones that were grounded because of childbearing, whatever. But somehow, and there's also this theory of how when the nomads kind of went through Europe, this agricultural society changed to one from a feminine principle of creation to one of domination and death.
Related to what? The nation state, I would think, probably, right?
Related later to the nation state.
So the evolution of the nation state and nations is an idea and a concept, and of the dominance of.
I say that Crete actually, which was a nation state, did have a more balanced feminine principle within their cosmovision, the way they led their society, and they were very advanced.
But the Europeans, with their Christian ideals of dominance, in other words, we need to save the heathen masses with Christianity. So the two go hand in hand. You have a domineering, an intent of the religion to go out and proselytize and dominate and control. In other words, to save humanity in that mindset. So that goes really well with it. The army follows close behind the missionaries, I guess, right? Or either or. The army goes in, the missionaries follow. So it's very interesting because it is all tied together. And then when you see the evolution of modern societies and the dominance of men and the requirements of the nation state, as an extension of this mindset thinking, well, we need to secure resources. Let's take oil as an example. We need to secure those resources. Well, it gets back to exactly what we're talking about, this male, what's evolved into a generally male-dominated quest to secure resources.
And there's a fear, right? There's a deep-seated fear of not having enough. And I think that is the biggest hurdle. Like, how do you convince, say, for example, a country like the US that is dominating world economy to have a more feminine approach towards leadership when there's this deep-seated fear that you may not have enough? And not to mention that, again, they say that, I think as Americans, we consume, I think it's 60% of global resources and so forth. So how do you maintain this way of living if you're going to share the table? But I mean, there may be a way. We go back to there may be a way, but this fear just doesn't allow, and obviously this fear that is very beneficial to certain interests, right? Certain parties that have economic interest, but this fear doesn't allow to kind of go over the hurdle and explore new ways of leadership.
Yes, I think there's a fear of letting go of the past. I think that many people are understanding intuitively, like yourself, myself, and others, that understand there needs to be a new way, a new path forward. But those people, as a rule, are not in leadership positions, or at least they're I mean, I think that there's some indications that is changing among the younger generation, and that they're seeing things in a different way. And you have the rise of, women within politics, and certainly Bernie Sanders types of democratic socialism and whatnot that are more, I would say, in line with what you're talking about. So I think there's a recognition, a lot of people, that there's a change is necessary. And again, perhaps the situation with COVID-19, while we may dislike intensely the vehicle for that change, it may end up being a catalyst because it reveals all the inherent weaknesses in the existing system. So the fragility, for example, of the current financial system is remarkably fragile. So what's that about? I mean, why is it that our economic system is on the verge of, I mean, you could say this is a very, very serious issue, and of course it's going.
I know, but so quickly. I mean, it's been what? It's been 1 week since we basically started having all these states shut down. And last week, actually, there were 3 million people who were applying for disemployment benefits.
Exactly.
Or unemployment benefits. So the thing is, you're right. I mean, it's amazing how quickly there's been an impact, due to the impact on airlines, et cetera. But this has been, the impact on airlines must have been perhaps 3 weeks ago. It started 3 weeks, a month ago. And in that, and obviously hotels and so forth. But yes, you're totally right. We see this immediately. The impact has been, the results of this impact are visible almost immediately.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Mr. Trump would defend the current, vision of our economy and our consumerist, model and whatnot. And I've been doing some thinking about this, and I think this all sort of segues together in terms of the discussion of masculine and feminine. But I think it's really coming to a head. I mean, I think that the debate between, what is the proper role of human beings vis-a-vis the earth and the environment, and how do we relate to it, and how do we, earn our keep, and what is the best way for human beings to survive and relate to the planet, and what does that society look like? I think that is all being questioned right now, whether or not we like it or not. I think it's being questioned. Some people are starting to think about, well, is what we've been doing the best way to approach things? Mm-hmm. But now, me and you, we might have been questioning the consumerist model for decades, even though we, in a way, partake in it. All of us partake in it. But I think moving forward, is the consumer model, is that the only one really that's viable, and really is it the best one?
Well, so, the only thing I would say is that this is not the first time that humans have questioned a system. And it's not only a system within a nation, but a system into the world they knew at that time, right? Be it Greeks or, the Renaissance. Like there are these times in history in which humanity suddenly seemed to be questioning how things were done and how people perceived reality. However, after those moments of questioning, what came was a strong backlash. Say, for example, after the Renaissance, you had the Inquisition. So this period of maybe 150, 200 years of the Renaissance was followed with an Inquisition that almost got to the 18th century, the 1700s, in which many, many people were killed and tortured in the most horrible ways. So that's the only thing that sometimes I'm worried about, that we have all these intelligent voices, because questioning doesn't mean that you already have a point of view. It means that you're just exploring what's going on and the what ifs. That's it. You're not a radical because you question. After you're questioning, you may become a radical, or you may actually be, decide that you are more of a, you have a more conservative point of view, whatever it is. But the questioning is something so essential to human beings that shouldn't be feared, I think. But somehow we've been taught to fear even questioning. But now that more people are doing that, sometimes I do worry that that will lead to some sort of backlash, because women are questioning, people are questioning, like we're questioning all these ways in which we do things. Will there be a strong reaction from the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger of that, and I think that, you know, in the recent past, I think in modern history, McCarthyism was an example of that kind of backlash that you're talking about. Or you could say that the rise of neoconservatism is also a sort of a backlash against New Deal economics. You know, you could say that. So you do see these sort of waves and back and forth. But I think that the good news is the internet and global communications may, you know, lead us to a situation where we can avoid that kind of thing if people that are thinking people, that are questioning people, rise up and can take more or less leadership positions within this new global communications paradigm.
Hopefully, because then you have the use of the internet, say for example, in countries with 1 billion citizens, like in China, or more actually, who cannot use the internet freely, who cannot use social media freely, and who have been, demanding freedom of press, etc., during this crisis, and immediately find that their communication is being surveilled, is being in a way controlled. Like, then where is that freedom to network?
So if we look at this, if we go back to Gandhi as an example, so I think that it has to start with the individual. It has to start with the individual. The individual needs to take responsibility for their own personal viewpoint and ethics. And that choice to be ethical is really the only thing that you can control in a way. So if you, as a little dot in the pointless landscape of the world, if you take responsibility for your own ethics, don't succumb to the dangers of modern, the modern society, a primary one being nihilism. Don't succumb to nihilism, or don't succumb to dogmatism. So nihilism, dogmatism, these extremes are what create the problems I think that you're describing. So all we can do, I think, in my mind, is to take ownership of our own psyche, of our own life.
But what I'm saying is, what if you have a system, a government, that is controlling what's supposed to be free, which is freedom of expression through the internet? Like you said, the internet and everything that comes with it, be it social media, whatever, it is a great tool unless it's controlled.
Well, again, who's it being controlled by? And if those people,
I mean, it shouldn't be controlled, should it?
if the people that are controlling, if the people that are controlling are grounded in a different kind of ethic, then they aren't going to be controlling. They're going to want to open it up. So I think that the people that wanted to open up the internet, the original DARPANET that evolved into the internet, the whole idea of this openness of the internet, that evolved from a certain ethic, a certain perception of reality, and a certain ideals. So those ideals need to be believed in and adhered to and defended. by individual people, whoever that is, at whatever level, however they can do that. So whether that, if you get blocked here, then you go here. If you can't post your blog here, then you hit the streets here. I mean, there has to be some method for the expression of those people in a mass way to bring about the change that's necessary. If the system, even in the United States, is too controlled with the Democrats and the Republicans, each reflecting sort of a corporate face and not really reflective of what the people want, which is to a certain extent becoming more and more apparent, and may again come into relief with COVID-19.
Yeah.
You know, if there isn't that, the people will eventually, I think, have their say. I'm an optimist that way. I have to be because I have to be because I think that we need to be for other people. I think we need to be that way.
And I do agree with you in the sense that it also starts with personal responsibility as to staying informed. Right. Because which I think is very important, with a free internet, with a free means of networking and communicating, there also comes the danger of fake news and manipulation and all these other things that, if you are not responsible for how you consume this information, you actually could be adding to the problem instead of actually solving it. So it's a two-way thing. Yeah, I agree.
It's nihilism, really, because nihilism allows for the lie. I would put Mr. Trump pretty much in that camp. The thing about nihilism, if you go back to the Buddhist definition of nihilism, is nihilism really says that you don't believe there are consequences for your actions. In other words, you think you can get away with it. Mm-hmm. And there's also some sort of expediency to it, but it's really basically gets back to ethics. If you feel like you can lie and get away with it, well, fake news is certainly a form of a lie. There could be those that put out fake news that actually believe that they're telling the truth. But believe me, somewhere back in that chain of information, somebody knew that they were lying. So somebody is seeing.
There's always a liar somewhere there.
Somewhere along the chain. Now, down levels down, this kid putting out information, and they fervently believe that they're telling the truth. And there's the whole elements of delusion that fall into come into play there as well. But I think that nihilism is a big problem. I think that ethics is a big problem. So again, fake news is really an ethical problem. Mm-hmm. Somewhere along the chain of command, somewhere along the chain of information, somebody's lying, and knowing likely that they're lying. So that if that didn't happen, that would be a big step forward, I think.
Of course, it is an ethical problem, but it's also a problem that it is an ethical problem. I guess that if you say that remaining analytical and curious and as a questioning being, that is also being ethical in a way, because you owe it not only to yourself, but to those who surround you. So yes, I would say it's ethical on both sides.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, I wanted to talk a little bit of, I'll segue to a little bit of a different discussion because I've been thinking about this a little bit. I think there's another issue that's core to this whole debate. And again, I think it relates back to the feminine and masculine as well. Mm-hmm. Is where do rights come from? Where do women's rights come from? Where do they emerge from? Are they inherent? Are you born with them, or do you earn them, or are you bestowed them? So I think that historically, if you look at conservatives generally tend to believe that rights are earned or bestowed.
Yeah.
Whereas the liberal mindset, including the Jeffersonian people, and this is where the idea of healthcare as a human right evolves from. the Bill of Rights and the second Bill of Rights that FDR put out, rights are inherent. In other words, you don't have to earn them. You don't have to earn your right to be equal.
Yeah.
As a woman, you don't have to go out and earn it.
And nobody should have the right to decide if they bestow them or not.
Exactly. So who's bestowing? It could be God bestowing, it could be the powers that be bestowing, whoever's bestowing. And if you look at the conservative mindset, I think as a rule, they will look at rights being bestowed or earned. Okay, woman, you go out and earn it. Then you can come to me about rights.
And you can swap woman for immigrant.
Sure.
Or, for whatever. It's, yes, that the view is that a person has to earn the right, or a being has to earn the right to be a person.
Right. So in terms of civics, if we, this is obviously not happening because the basic education in this country of civics, a big gaping hole. There are children that are not learning that this country was founded on the actual idea that rights are inherent. These are natural rights. There was a whole series of philosophical arguments over history that people debated this for, hundreds of years and decades or whatever. The whole Enlightenment was based upon this. So basically, we continue to have this debate, which is the debate that goes back to the Enlightenment. Are rights inherent or are they earned? And as long as people believe the rights are earned, we're going to have a problem. We need to get people on the same page, I think.
Yeah, the thing is, and I think that goes back to this mentality of scarcity, because once you accept that rights are inherent, then what right do you have to decide the future of another nation?
Exactly.
And then if you can't decide their future, how can you take their resources?
Right. So this is what I'm talking about. Is that not?
I'm saying nation, but it could be community. So say, for example, that you're a mining company and you bought the rights as if they were something you could trade to exploit a certain area, then that supersedes the rights of the community who lives there and doesn't want to see their environment polluted. Again, it brings up all these questions. And I guess that is why, you're talking about a debate that started 300 years ago.
At least.
At least, if not before, because it really was discussed with the Greeks, right? Yeah, it already had started there, talking about rights of women and so forth. So anyway, so if you're I think we're skirting around the answer because our economics are based on bestowing.
There you go. So you have a disconnect between the economics, the values of the economic system and the values of the political system on paper. I'm not saying the values of the political system as executed. On paper, you have this disconnect between the Enlightenment thinking and the capitalists. Mm-hmm. Let's say roughly lumping that into this system we call capitalism. Consumerism, capitalism, whatnot. So,
and I would also say at least communism as we know it, yeah. To be honest, because it's whatever communism was supposed to be, it's not.
Right.
Or maybe it is what it was supposed to be. We'll never know, right? The thing is, what communism is specifically, I would say it's not subtle at all in how it bestows rights to certain groups and takes rights from others in the most basic way.
I wish I was more of a student of communism, but I know on paper it sounded great. I think the execution of it again was pretty dubious.
Yes.
But as a rule.
Yeah. So maybe we leave our dialogue for today here. It was I always enjoy our conversations, and we'll pick up soon. Does that sound good?
That sounds terrific. So you know,
I'm
hopefully,
going to stop the recording now, and then we'll wrap up.
gotcha. Thank you.